Good evening, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us for this event. My name's Jamie Cook. I'm Head of Engagement at the RSA, and I'm delighted that you've been able to take part in this, where we'll be looking at creativity in the workplace. And actually, I'm really looking forward to the discussions and learning and expertise that's going to be shared with us tonight. I was very lucky to get a bit of a sneak preview in our discussions before we started. And I think it's such a critically important topic for us. We know that creativity is such a fundamental human characteristic, and yet quite often it's something that is either challenged or not encouraged or can be difficult to express. So I'm really looking forward to learning how we as organizations, businesses and societies can really value and allow this to flourish, and hopefully for the discussions that we'll have later on with that. So I'm going to hand over to Alastair Pearce, who has organised and set up tonight's event, and then Alastair, Ines and Enrique will share with us their thoughts before we come back for some discussion later on in the event. So Alastair, I'll hand over to you. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Jamie. And thanks very much, RSA Scotland, for organising this event. I'm Professor Alastair Pearce, and until recently, I've not screen shared yet, please, Jamie. I'll shout when we need the first one. And until recently, I've led colleges, music colleges, drama colleges, and more recently in Southeast Asia, an arts university. And obviously working in that sort of environment, we've employed lots of practicing highly creative people as staff, and we've taught lots of students who are going to be the next generation of creative professionals. And over the years of doing that, I started to recognize similar concerns popping up over and over again, regardless of the discipline that the member of staff or the student was working within. Concerns common to all of humanity, but with a particular influence on the creativity of the people with whom I was working. So all creative, but some were worried about is their creativity going to continue? So worried about the longevity of creativity, and the creative caricature that I've created to distill and show that characteristic, that common concern of creatives, that will my creativity last? I've called that character Wobbly. Then there are other creatives who are fascinated by the detail of creativity and just can't stop doing it, even though the project they've been working on is absolutely fine, but they just can't let it go. And I've called that character Picky. Then there's the character, one of my favorites is the creative person who uses creativity almost as a revolutionary weapon. And in my experience, usually a revolutionary weapon aimed at the leader of the organization, which in recent years has been me. But so sometimes painful, but extraordinarily helpful. And that character I call Molotov for obvious reasons. Then there's Monk. Monk, it describes a characteristic that some creatives have, where they're totally dedicated to their vocation. They're so into what they're doing that they actually, at a fundamental level, don't think that they're working for the organization that pays their salary, but considers in reality it's the organization that's working for them, because they are facilitating the creativity of the person, which is so fundamentally to his or her personality that it has to be carried out. The organization has a duty to employ them so that the creative can carry out what he or she wants to do. So, and I'll just tell you one more. I'm going to concentrate on just two of these in the rest of this presentation, but I'll just tell you one more to give you a flavor of where my mind is going. Some creative people, in my experience, are sometimes so wrapped up in the unfolding of their own creative narrative, so bound up with that personal narrative of who they are and what they're doing, that sometimes the ambition of that narrative can result in people who aren't so into this kind of issues around creativity can think of that they are actually lying about it. The classic example is you ask a creative, hey, Jim, when are you going to be finishing your bit? Because I've then got to do some work on it. Oh, don't worry, it'll be ready by Friday. And you know if you're Jim's colleague that is not going to be ready by Friday, it can't be ready by Friday. And you know Jim knows that you know, and he knows that you know he knows and everything. But anyway, so I've called this character Fibber, because he fibs, he tells sort of semi-untruths, but it's because he's creative and because he's so keen on the unfolding narrative of his creativity. So all these creatives are vital to the organization, but they have different personality motivations that are, generally speaking, inseparable from their creativity. If they didn't have those motivations, they wouldn't be as creative. And it makes them wonderful to work with, exciting to work with, but sometimes quite tricky to work with, and particularly sometimes quite tricky to manage. So having sort of sorted out in my own mind these kind of creative stereotypes, if you like, these distillations of particular characteristics of creativity, I decided to form my company working with creatives that advises companies and other organizations how best to get the best creativity out of their colleagues. And I've just written a book about it as well, which is coming out in the next couple of months. So that's why I'm here today at the RSA's Creativity in the Workplace seminar. And again, thank you to RSA Scotland. But I'd like to go on now just to share with you what I regard as two difficult truths, two tricky truths. And the first tricky truth is organizations are organized, but creativity isn't organized. A tricky truth. An obvious contradiction between the organization of the organization and the less organized, sometimes apparently chaotic process of creativity. That's my first tricky truth. And my second tricky truth is many organizations rely for their success, rely for their progress on the creativity of people who work for them. But few organizations seem to me to know how to nurture that creativity effectively. So how can an organization that relies on the creativity of its employees possibly help those creative colleagues produce their best creativity when they know they need creativity, but they don't know how to nurture that creativity? It's a dialogue of the deaf, and these creative colleagues don't seem always, and I know I'm generalizing wildly, and forgive me for that, colleagues, these creative colleagues don't seem to fit into the organized life of the organization. They're different in some ways. How should the organization respond to that and help and nurture these creative people? And I'm going to answer that question just by using two examples of my creative caricatures. So can we have the first slide, please, Jamie? First slide is artiste. Yeah, okay, here's artiste. Read what he says about himself. Okay, now the first thing to say, and this is serious stuff, I refer to artiste as her. And so we must have a quick detour, colleagues, before I'm thrown out of this seminar on gender and creativity. In all the years that I've worked with creative people, I've seen no association between gender and creativity, either in the degree of creativity achieved or in the subject-based focus of that creativity. So why have I called artiste her? It's random. It's simply my attempt to breathe some life and humanity into these otherwise abstract caricatures of creativity that I've invented. I've given them all names and genders. The names to summarize their creative personalities, in this case, artiste, and the gender randomly out of a hat. The name artiste, because she is a bit self-obsessed, at least when viewed from some perspectives. And she is a she, because that happened to be in my hat when I pulled it out. So I hope that justifies this naming and giving genders to. It's a technique that I find helps organizations. I hope it helps you to think, oh yeah, I know an artiste. I work with one. I know a fibber. I know a Molotov. By giving them some aspects of humanity, I hope it helps you to recognize in your own workplace these people more easily. And that's my explanation. So can we please have slide 2, please? The next slide. So artiste hates her work being criticized. She loves her work. She's protective, can't let it go. Let's think about something that let's imagine you're artiste's manager and you're discussing artiste with your manager. So you might say something like, well, artiste, yeah, she's actually rather good in teams. Well, she's good in teams when everybody is talking about her latest project, and for as long as there's positive comments coming out. But she's not good at hearing, and certainly not taking advice, though. And there's another thing about artiste you might say to your manager. She hates watching focus groups. She gets really twitchy when they're judging her work. But when it's complimented, it's like she's a different person. I swear she just glows. And I know everybody likes that reaction, but for artiste, it's as if her life depends on it. It's sort of oxygen for her. And there's one final thing about artiste, and you're still talking to your manager at this stage. She can't let a project go. Even after she's done all the initial creative stuff, which is her speciality, and the implementation people are wanting to get hold of the idea to actually turn it into something we can sell. She still demands to be involved. She won't let it go. She really should let it just go on. She should let it go on, and she should get on with the next creative project that she's got to do. But she just can't. So, artiste loves her work, hates criticism, is very protective, and can't let it go. Let's look now at what's good about working with artiste. And next slide, please. So she's dedicated, she goes for quality, and she cares. What's tricky about working with artiste? Next slide, please. So, too protective, personal tangents, misses deadlines and budgets perhaps, seems to be all about her, and you wonder, from a totally unqualified perspective, a bit of a narcissist perhaps. So the next slide, please. So her work is an expression of herself, an extension of her own DNA. Her work is her child. Criticize her work, therefore, and you're criticizing her. Not surprising that she says criticism is very wounding to her. So what would good management or good colleague interaction look like when working with an artiste, or with somebody who sometimes is a bit like artiste, or somebody who has a bit of artiste about his or her personality. Let's look at the next slide. Okay, there are a couple of easy ones on this list and one really hard, important one right at the end. So celebrate her dedication for aiming at the highest levels of creativity. Yeah, absolutely. So make it clear that she's doing a terrific job and her creativity is wonderful. Assign her projects that engage her at a personal level, because this is just common sense. If she's not emotionally engaged, because you remember we're talking about her children here, if she's not emotionally engaged in a project, it's pointless asking her to work on it, because it won't be her best work. The last one, which I've rather pompously called mediate the discontinuity between organizational requirements and artiste, is the hard one. And this one isn't unique to artiste in any way. You'll find that of all the things that I'm asked to do with various companies, it's this issue, the interface between the creative and the organization, that is key. It's a vital job for creatives managers. What they have to do is translate, and this is in both directions, between the creative and the organization. It's difficult, it requires huge amounts of care and concentration, but it is absolutely essential. One last thing about artiste. Should management, should human resources, should you as a colleague change artiste from being an artiste? My view is no. Even if you were to succeed, and you probably wouldn't, that would limit her creativity, because artiste's creativity and thus her value to your organization depends on her being artiste. So that's it for artiste. Let's now go on to the next slide, slide 7. Just trying to make myself a bit more visible. Okay, this one's called Solo. And Solo says of himself, and indeed, what's wrong with that? He just wants to see things through from start to finish. This is an example of a creative whose understanding of themselves might not match up with your understanding of the creative. Solo is your creative colleague who comes up with great ideas, but only when he's alone. He's a soloist. Solo just doesn't, his creativity just doesn't thrive in teams. But I'm sure you've got some colleagues at work who do very well in teams. And it's useful just to reflect for a minute or so about what characteristics these great team members need. Next slide, please. So I'm suggesting they often need to be pragmatic and happy to work towards a shared goal. They solve problems. And the way in which teams often progress is through that well-known process of forming, storming, norming, and performing, where after the forming has happened and the storming with the arguments has died down, they get down to norming and consensus building, where goals are clarified and roles and responsibilities are defined and agreed. And that's before the performing phase, where results are produced based on that earlier consensus, informed by practicality. So the outcomes of this team will be consensual and workable. Great. Really, and I'm not being sarcastic, it is great, because it's a good, straightforward way of solving problems. It might be, for example, that your company is going to have an audit visit in 2 months' time. Then put a team on it. Yeah, they'll work towards it and it'll come out with a great audit result. What I'm just kind of suggesting quietly, though, is it's not always such a great way if you're wanting higher level creativity. And it's for higher level creativity that you've employed Solo. And Solo's process, his creative process, is unlikely to be forming, storming, norming, performing. It's more likely to be, next slide, please, saturation, incubation, illumination. Solo is saturated in his area of work. He's been fascinated and worked within it for years. He lives in a saturated world of his particular area of expertise, whatever that is. Now he's got a particular project within that area assigned to him, and he then incubates that idea in the light of all that saturating experience, working through the creative process that's almost certainly indeterminate, uncertain, risky, unstructured, and unreliable. Maybe illumination will pop out after the incubation phase. Maybe it won't. Solo's way of working is too undirected and indeterminate for traditional teamwork that looked for consensual, workable, practical, and predictable outcomes, often which are just minor evolutions of the status quo. No. Solo's creativity is almost certainly depends on his unique view of the world and the personal story he writes about it and himself whilst incubating his creativity before the illumination of his idea, when it's ready to be revealed. Of course, he's rubbish in teams. He has to be for his creativity to exist. Or put more elegantly, as Bonnie Siegler put it in her book, Dear Client. Next slide, please. She said, vision is not a group activity. But anyway, for whatever I've said, and I hope some of it rings true to some of you, it looks like team working in organization is here to stay, at least for the foreseeable future, with Solo being required to contribute his creativity. So how can you and your organization get useful creative ideas from Solo, who is honestly trying his best to contribute? And the next slide has some suggestions. So I'm suggesting that just get Solo to do particular bits of team projects. And that's probably before the team really gets going. The team can then pick up the creative ideas that Solo has come up with and then turn them into practical outcomes. Just get him to report on his own contributions. Protect his ideas from the early criticism of the more pragmatic types. Don't worry if he's hiding, and make it clear he can work from wherever he likes, whenever he likes. And he should be reassured to know that he will not be responsible for detailed implementation of his creativity, for it's only the quality of his creative ideas that matter to the team, not their practicality. So can you end the shared screen, please, now, and come back to Big Me? Thank you. So Artiste, in conclusion, Artiste and Solo are just two of my caricatures, my characters of creativity. And as I've said, you can find all the others in my book, which is coming out in Europe in June and September for the rest of the world. The important thing is that all the creative characters in the book summarize, kind of distill aspects of creativity that are quite often seen in organizations. It's distilling real people into these caricatures. But these people are useful to your organization, but each should prompt different management and colleague interactions if their potential for assisting your organization is really to be reached.